Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable on this sunny June morning. A huge welcome to you all. Massive thanks for joining us today in what's looking to be a really interesting session. My name is Matt Baird. I've been running this platform now for the last 5 years, on and off, particularly kind of off. This is episode 182, I believe. And today we're joined by Joe Williams, who I'll introduce in just a moment, from Settle Group, who I'm commonly really kind of interesting and insightful perspective to some of the work that they've been doing over at Settle and can share with you today. For those who are new, we run this every single Tuesday at 11 a.m. So a big welcome if this is your first time. You can find our entire back catalogue on YouTube and Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. But more importantly, this is a place that encourages debate and encourages discussion. So if you do have difference of thought, disagreements, whatever it might be, that's encouraged here. Please do share. We want to hear. We don't want to be in an echo chamber. We want to make sure we're in a position where we can really hear all sides of the coin. Day to day, I work in recruitment. That's what I've done for 14 years. It's what I've been self-employed for the last 4.5 years. If you're looking for recruitment support, that literally goes towards keeping this free and running for everybody. So if you are looking for any support in that world, please do reach out. It's that, as I say, that keeps this running for as long as we possibly can. And I want to say a big thank you to both Alertical and to CMSG for sponsoring the roundtable in 2025. It's a massive thanks to you as well for keeping this platform running. So on to today. Joe actually reached out, I don't know, maybe 6 months, a year ago, whatever it might be. So we were at a conference, like, oh, you're Matt, you run the roundtable. It's like, oh, yeah, look, nice to meet you. How are things going? He's like, yeah, I've never been, but I listen to your sessions every single week on the road and on various kind of routes to work or between sessions or whatever it might be. And the fact you record them is hugely beneficial because I don't have time to attend on the day, but I can always catch up on the recordings. And then I think at the end of last year, you sent me your Spotify Wrapped and you were percent of listeners. I was like, this is so bizarre that the Social Housing Roundtable has a Spotify Wrapped. This is fantastic. So we got to know each other. I then worked with Settle from a recruitment perspective, and Settle are the business that I've mentioned before that actually use the Social Housing Roundtable as part of their CPD, and that alone still feels a little bit surreal to me, but is fantastic. So Joe, who recently got promoted and is now executive director, so huge congratulations to you. But what I also want to do is pass over to Joe to introduce important to Settle at the moment, but also where that shifting mindset is. And I think that the journey that you'll hopefully see and that I'm really intrigued in by is just how much you're constantly pivoting and moving, and this isn't a blueprint because there's no such thing. It's a shifting miasma and what you're having to do to continually, engage and support residents in the best way that you can, while still remaining a functioning landlord in the best way you can, both financially and operationally. So, Joe, a huge welcome to you today, and welcome to the platform.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you everybody for joining today. I'm going to start by attempting to share my screen, and let's keep fingers crossed that the technology is kind. Have had a few problems, so hopefully you can see that now.
Just loading. We're good to go.
We're good to go. That's wonderful to hear. If at any point it crashes, then Matt, I might refer to you for the PDF I've sent you through. But as I said, a huge thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Joe Williams. I'm the Executive Director of Customer Services at Settle. As Matt alluded to, I'm, I guess, a long-time listener, first-time caller. So as the names were popping up, as people were joining, I actually recognise a lot of you from listening, as Matt says, on the road to the social housing podcast that keep me going. So looking forward to some lively debate as the session moves on. Hopefully you've got the second slide now. We good? Yeah, wonderful. So a little bit about Settle. Yeah, wonderful. As you can see here, we are fairly closely geographically located. We're across Herts, Beds, Buckinghamshire, South Cambridgeshire, 23,000 residents, about 10,000 homes, 300 colleagues. What drives our services really is the purpose and the vision of the organisation. And I know a lot of organisations can talk a good game, but this really does sit over the services that we provide, and that importance of providing a firm foundation for residents and that safe, comfortable and affordable home. I hope you can see as we move through this today how that's always behind what we're doing in terms of the housing service delivery. Alongside that, there's a focus on delivering investment. We want to make decisions that have the biggest impact, and data is really key to that. And again, this will be a theme that comes through. And alongside all of this, as you may have seen reported, we are progressing a partnership with Paradigm, which is moving at a good pace. And as part of that, we are looking at, in terms of integration, what the right model is and how we work moving forward. So a little bit about me. Something that has stayed with me with presentations is trying to make them a bit different. So there's a bit of a theme today, and I hope you'll bear with this, but there's some references to some older TV and movies that are kind of my favourites. This one, perhaps not so much a favourite, but it's an old nickname, Joe 90, and I thought, well, what better way to introduce myself than by putting my nickname in as well. I've been in the sector for 18 years. I've had the privilege of working at Richmond Housing, Poplar Harker, and more recently settled in that time. I started my career working in the call centre and then moved to a housing officer role. And those initial experience and those engagement and the amount of time I was able to spend with residents has really stayed with me in terms of helping me to think as I've moved through my career and what's best and how services can be shaped by the voice of those that it matters to the most. My current role, as Matt said at the beginning, is Executive Director, but prior to that I was Director of Housing, and that's when I oversaw the change in our operating model back in 2023. So what today is all about, split up into a few kind of distinct parts. We've got how the changes come about, what were the drivers, the importance of the resident voice in that, but also the colleague feedback and the data and the role that that played. We will do a deep dive into the model itself and give you a bit more detail on how that works, some of the challenges we found and how it's constantly evolving. And that connects really well to the feedback loop and how that resident voice, that colleague feedback and the data that I mentioned is helping to shape and evolve as time moves on. Most importantly, it's a chance to hear from all of you with any questions you've got for any other organisations that are changed the model, considering changing the model, are happy with their model. It'd be really good to hear from you as well. So another film reference to kick us off. What were the drivers for change? For those that don't know, this is the Blues Brothers and Jake and Elwood in a fairly iconic shot in the car. So I want to start with where we was and what the service was looking like back in 2023. So we had a fairly traditional setup, I guess you could say. We had patch-based neighbourhood officers, housing officers. The average patch size was about 1,050. They dealt with core housing, so it didn't include things like income and leasehold. There were separate services for that. We had a separate independent living team, retirement living team is what we used to call that, and colleagues that were based more across the schemes, not always predominantly in the schemes. They might have been spread across a few. And then we also had our own tenancy support and ASB officers and services that were separate as well. The ASB officers dealt with the high-risk antisocial behaviour, what we might use to term as Category 1 cases. Tenancy support supported our most vulnerable residents to help sustain tenancies within our scope as a housing provider. And that was managed by senior management for neighbourhood separately from income, but we also had 4 team leaders and also a senior. So there was quite a bit of management support in place for that fairly traditional model. So what's key to consider here is what residents were saying back in 2023. Now, I don't want to necessarily suggest that all residents were unhappy with the service, but the point I'm making here is that the themes we were starting to see were becoming more consistent, and we were seeing more comments like the 3 that I've pointed out here. So these are actual quotes from back in that period of time. The TSMs had just launched, so we had a very small sample size and some data there, but it wasn't really enough for us to use the TSMs as the main driver. It did help, but it was transactional feedback, it was complaints, it was things we were hearing from residents when we met with them or went to resident meetings that were starting to paint a consistent picture of a service that could be improved. And as I said, it didn't mean all residents were unhappy, but we saw an opportunity certainly to try and do something differently. And I think the things that stand out for me there are the part about not being responsive, the fact that the housing officer kept changing, and but we weren't able to be there in person, and quite often that was down to workload demands that stopped us getting out to our neighbourhoods as well. So what we did with that was we took it a step further, and our resident scrutiny panel, our voice of resident is what we call it, that was set up in 2023. We engaged them quite early, and we completed a housing workshop on services to see what their views were. And we found that generally the views were quite echoed. Again, there were some that were happier than others, but the themes were not seeing enough of the team, and also recognition, because we had some people on the Voice of Resident panel that lived in independent living schemes and some that lived in general needs. And when I say independent living, just to clarify, those are our schemes. We've got 18 of them where we have over 55s living in what used to be, I guess you deem as sheltered accommodation, when there was previously things like a warden service. So we had an understanding, if you like, of the difference in demand for independent living and also general needs, but the recognition that there was pressures on the housing officers, the neighbourhood officers predominantly. So they had patch sizes of 1,050, and for the independent living officers that we had, the average sort of responsibility and numbers was 71. So a real difference between the demands there, and we were finding an increase in overlap in the roles and the work that was being done. So the direct feedback we were getting was critical in us thinking about what we did next. We took that feedback and we wanted to take it a step further. And as you can see here, one of the main things was about, we want a quicker response. It doesn't have to be a dedicated officer. So what that led to was a survey that we completed, and we got good engagement from residents on this. The questions that were asked, we kept it simple about whether people wanted a designated officer or how quickly you can speak to someone. And the reason we did that was some of the feedback we'd had previously was about having, I want my own housing officer, I want my own point of contact, but we could sense a shift in, actually, I just want you to get back to me and hear what it is that I'm saying. So we had a fairly overwhelming response, with 91% of residents saying it was about the speed of the response, and obviously, of course, the quality of that, and only 9% were as focused on a designated officer. The other thing that we asked here was about whether we have enough presence in the local community, and that for me is really key. If you're going to make a change, we know that transactional approaches in terms of residents being digitally enabled or being able to do things for themselves is great, but there are times, and it really does depend on the demand, where we need to be in our communities and responding. And you can see here that 54% said yes, and they were more happy, but that's not where we wanted to be, and quite clearly 46% were not as happy. So where this led us to was looking at the data alongside the resident feedback. And we could see from kind of further investigation into this that when we compared the two different neighbourhood patches, and there are 8 of these, the one with the highest demand in terms of the case contacts coming in was double the one that was the lowest. Now, the patch numbers, if you like, were fairly similar, but actually the demand within each was so different, and we were just basing it on, well, if a colleague has give or take 1,050 properties, it's the same across the board, they should be able to cope. But that wasn't the reality. We were seeing that the average time on ASB cases was going up, and it was 26 hours, again, due to capacity. Tenancy support officers were spending 8.8 months on average on cases, and that was just, again, down to not having availability and capacity to respond to what was coming through. And actually, the average waiting time on cases was continuing to go up. They were finding there was about 10 cases just waiting to be allocated because there was such a demand on tenancy support. And alongside that, the average case time spent per week for tenancy support was 30 hours, and the average for independent living was 10. And that was because a lot of the independent living work that was being done in terms of time spent with residents just wasn't being captured in a way that we could really measure and that we could measure outputs from. The final 2 points are just around that imbalancing kind of resource. So we had 33% of the resource, which was the independent living team. There was 13 of those. They were supporting only 8% of homes. And we found that when we did further analysis, that when you looked at the over 55s, only 11% of those actually lived in the scheme. So the point I'm making there is that we had a lot of people over a certain age, and that didn't mean that they were vulnerable, but we know that people in late life might need more support, depending on circumstances. We weren't able to get to because of where the concentration of our resource was. So that imbalance in workload and resource really needed to be looked at in more detail. What we then looked at was what our colleagues were saying. And again, some fairly powerful quotes here about workload, about spread of work, about guilt in terms of taking time off. And it was really affecting morale in the team. So we had the resident feedback, we had the data, we had challenges around the resource, and we had colleague feedback here saying that at the minute they were finding it hard and it wasn't quite working for them. So you could say in some ways it was a no-brainer, but we needed to be sure if we were going to change something that it was the right thing to do. And when you consider these things as well, regulation, legislation and sector drivers on top of that, it became clear that there was a chance to do something different here, and that would really meet the requirements and the pressure that was being put on the sector for very, very good reasons. And it was following this, we had the sad case with AWAB as well, and the legislation that's changing as a result of that. But we were already at this point in time thinking about what we needed to do differently next. And as I said, the TSMs are just launched, so we've been able to use a lot of that data and that feedback since to help inform how we've adjusted the service. So, deep dive into demand-led. This is a kind of what drew me today to putting in movie references. I was trying to explain about the perfect model and how to articulate what that means. And I think the quote from this film that stays with me is you're not perfect, and let me save you the suspense, the girl you met isn't either. The question is whether you're perfect for each other. So if you bear with the analogy, the point I'm making here is that is the model you've got right for the organisation? It's not going to be perfect, and you as an organisation aren't going to be, but are you the right match, and is it the right thing to change it? And again, we came to a place where we could see a different way of working that would be a better match for Settle and a better match for residents. So what is demand-led? If you don't know, it's really driven by resident need and community preference. So it's a shift from being patch-based, having a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, if you like, to being led by demand and allocating work based on capacity. So as an inquiry comes in, the way we do it is to look at certain parameters before allocating a case. So it won't just be based on that person's got 20, that person's got 19, it goes to them. It's actually the hours that each case takes that we've got the analysis on. So we have some science behind it, but it leads itself to a more balanced and fair allocation of work. And that helps greater operational efficiency. So I don't know if I've got a question there.
No, just on, I was just needing to mute. That was all.
Fine. I just heard myself back, and I've again recognised how frustrating my own voice is. But there we are. So it's responsive to residents' needs, and that enables agile service delivery. And finally, the allocation of work demand. It's that capacity within the service that we saw as a real virtue in changing how we approached the work. We had to weigh up how we managed the change and ensure that residents felt listened to. That was really key throughout this. So why did it appeal? The biggest thing, and I put this in bold, was an opportunity as we saw it to improve resident satisfaction. It was about appropriate allocation of resources. We wanted to be more visible in our neighbourhoods. We saw the opportunity to be more engaged with the workforce and to distribute work more fairly. It's things like having work covered when people are away. The opportunity to really look at co-creation and to look at the plans we have for our neighbourhoods alongside this as well. And also using evidence and data-led decision making, so that constant forecasting of our data to see where demand is going to be as well as where it is currently was another reason that it appealed, because we saw a real opportunity to forward think with the service as well as just look at the current point we were at. So what happened next? So the key bits with this really were, once we decided to change, the business case was approved, and we wrote to all residents. We included the outcome of the survey, the rationale for why we'd done it, what the proposal was. We entered into a consultation period with colleagues, and as a result of that, the restructure went ahead. New roles were introduced. The main impact was on the independent living officers. So the balance in this, and I guess if you might want to see it as the trade-offs were, we couldn't carry on with all the services as they were. If we were going to shift our approach to being demand-led, we knew something had to give. And I said at the beginning, the difference in where our independent living resource was focused, but actually over 55s, being sort of 90% of general needs stock, as well as those living within schemes. We moved to a model of having a similar approach to independent living as we did general needs. So it was led by demand. We didn't have people based in those schemes all of the time, but we responded to demand where it came up. And that allowed us to more effectively balance the work we were doing across all 10,000 homes and make sure that it was a fairer way of distributing work for the colleagues that were going to be working in these areas. One of the key things for me, and then I'd suggest this to anybody, is that you've got to own the change. So I did all of the consultation meetings and went to visit the independent living schemes along with the executive director at the time, Dean. And it's important because that's where we We had the flack, we had the frustrations, the concerns. It allowed us to listen, it allowed us to think a bit differently. And I'm not going to say that we were able to solve every query that we had, but we were there to listen to residents and to explain in a bit more detail what we were doing. And particularly for the scheme, some of the people that didn't really understand what we'd sent out and were trying to understand the implications for them, allowed us to engage with them and their families. And we've been back again since to visit those schemes to sort of get reflections on how it's going and where we can continue to improve. So we kept gathering feedback, and it's about where we could learn lessons. So the new model, this is really more revolution than evolution. The demand is resident-led. We have coaches. So the structure of the team, and I can share the structure charts if anybody wants it afterwards, but we have 3 coaches that manage neighbourhood, community safety and tenancy support partners. So we have separate distinctions in that work. They work across 3 areas, which are our biggest and most in-demand neighbourhoods and areas geographically. And really key within this is we have coordinator roles. They act as a gatekeeper and help with the allocation of work. So they will back things that aren't for neighbourhoods. They will check diaries and assess where there's capacity. And one of the things that we're also doing alongside this and developing is the visits being booked through smart scheduling. So we've recently introduced another piece of software called Pan Connect, which supports with colleagues being out in the field and being able to access live information relating to residents and our areas. And that's really going to help us as well take that to the next level. What's key within this is that risk-based approach to visits. So one of the big things in these trade-offs, what it's enabled us to do is to actually visit residents as a minimum every 6 months. So previously it was getting to the year mark and we were getting guest safety check visits done and things were being flagged. Under the new model, we have a trigger. If we don't hear from a resident for 6 months, we will contact them. That might be on the phone, it might be in person, depending on the response we get, to make sure they're okay, to see if there's anything they need and to any services that they need help with. And that's something we do now as part of the new model that we couldn't do previously. And that, as I said, it leads to more complexity and vulnerability, and us recognising those things, but actually the capacity to deal with those things. We have a greater ability to do that now. So another slide, the plot twist. This is Usual Suspects, if you don't know, and one of the greatest plot twists of all time at the end of that. Slightly provocative perhaps, but what do I know? So what this ended up being wasn't what I thought it would be to begin with. Now, we used the resident feedback, the colleague feedback and the data to get us moving, but the original vision was to have demand across all 10,000 homes. And actually, as we worked through the consultation, the feedback was this would work better if you had it for the 3 biggest areas. We have kind of geographical areas around our 3 biggest areas, and then spread the remaining demand for the remaining places as well across all of the teams. So the 3 areas we have connect to our 3 teams, and within those teams you've got these teams of 6 or 7 that include tenancy support, community safety and the neighbourhood partners. They work together, so they have a presence locally, they get to know the people, but it isn't reliant on one point of reference for the cases. They're able to flex and move, and if someone goes off, it doesn't mean they come back to a ton of work. It's picked up by the rest of the team. We also increased our coordinator resource because there was more of a need to allocate effectively. So we've got 2 of the people in that role. The data has also demonstrated demand for increased community safety. So we've got 3 of the safety partners now, community safety partners, what we used to call our ASB officers. And the resident feedback as well has really helped from our neighbourhood plans to where our resource needs to be prioritised. So we're looking at demand, but we're listening to the resident and moving and shifting our resource in a more agile way to things that come up. And sometimes seasonal fluxes, we get busier areas in the summer compared to the winter. We can move in a much more effective way to make sure that we're not getting behind on the contacts that are coming in. So yeah, the point I'm making here is it was different to what I thought it would be, but it's much better. And I think as leaders, you've got to be humble and recognise that it's better to listen to those that are the experts than to what you might think originally. So for the last section, just our feedback loop. This is reference to one of my favourite films, Heat, and a very iconic scene between Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And there's a famous quote, and it's about feeling the heat around the corner. And what I mean by this is it's about feeling and hearing what the feedback is, what's coming next. There's so much pressure on us as a sector at the minute, so we need to be ready to respond to that, but to be hearing the resident voice and seeing what the trends are. So what we've learned and what's improved, we've got TSM data that we can compare to the previous year now, and you can see some marginal gains here. we've not listed them all, but actually all 12 of our TSM perceptions of questions have improved this year compared to the previous one. Overall service is the biggest one for me. We've seen a jump there. You can see the difference kind of across the board between 3 to 6% with just some of the ones that I've pulled out. One of the ones I just want to draw some attention to is approach to handling ASB, and I'm trying to give some balance here to say this isn't perfect, it's improving. But the actual approach to handling ASB TSM was less than 10% actually had an ASB case was settled. So part of the task for us is using our transactional feedback to see what we need to improve. And we can see at the minute that how we update victims during cases is key, but also managing expectations of ASB is a big driver. The other thing I'd just draw some attention to is our trust score. We've jumped quite a bit in the space of the last 2 years from our starting point. And we're seeing more contacts in timescale. So a 10% improvement in contacts in timescale to 95% compared to the previous model. And we're actually answering and getting back to more residents and more cases. The numbers are going up, but we're responding more effectively in time. And finally, colleague satisfaction. We've seen our engagement score on Peakon improve as well. So what can we improve? The TSMs is in the last slide. You'll see there's room for improvements there. So it's acting on that feedback. One of the trends we've seen within the TSMs is our over 55s in schemes. There's an opportunity to improve how we do things there. So we're about to go out and do a series of visits and look at what we can do differently with our resource and how we can move that to help with some of the feedback we're getting. We're still seeing some fluxes in workload even within the areas. So we need to figure out how we respond to that and whether there's any change or balance between the three teams. Expectations of the service and sometimes internally where we've been able to improve and do more. Sometimes there's more pressure from other services to pass the work over. So it's managing what is neighbourhood work and what sits in other areas. And also we've got lower demand outside of our biggest three areas. So we're looking at how we engage more effectively and gain that feedback in the weeks and months ahead. Last few slides. So how we're responding, we're reviewing the trends in the TSMs and the feedback, as I've just mentioned, focusing on independent living. We're looking at that resourcing and whether the model needs to be tweaked. One of the key things is continuing to listen to colleagues. So we had a meeting week before last where we gathered some more feedback on how our colleagues were feeling about the model and where we could improve. And then it's about how we respond to that. So can we act upon any of that feedback in the same way as we are with residents as well? Data is absolutely key, and particularly that forward look and prediction of future services and what that looks like. So where do we need to focus demand? Is there going to be future fluctuations that mean we need to move resource ahead of time? Can we engage with residents ahead of time to try and limit that issue before it becomes a problem? And that's really helping us as we start to look at what we do in the next year. So in conclusion, it's evolution, not revolution, where we've ended up. It's that constant improvement, listening to feedback. And again, I know I've repeated some of these points today, but only because they're so important. And it's the same with the colleague feedback. We need to make sure that those within the team feel valued and that it helps to inform adjustments to the services. Data is helping us to look ahead. There's a relentless focus on marginal gains. So what we've seen with the TSMs and transactional surveys, you're not going to see massive jumps when you make a change. It's going to take time incrementally to improve. But if we keep seeing that and we keep seeing the feedback trends change, we know we're on the right path. And it's just key that we keep listening throughout that time. And we are, as I said at the beginning, in a partnership which is progressing at pace. So looking at the best model as part of the integration and how that will work better and more effectively for a bigger resident base is key. So the final slide, and just leaning on that point on feedback, here's 3 quotes from more recently in the last sort of 3 months that we've had from residents on the service. You can read these for yourselves, but the things that really stand out to me about residents feeling safe, how quickly we've acted, the fact that they know who their neighbourhood partners are, and the swiftness of response. And the point at the end there about a cool head and handling competing priorities is one that really stuck with me. So we've got more quotes like that. We've also got some that show we need to make improvements, but we're seeing more of that sort of thing in the same way that we weren't before. So it's helping to show us that we're doing the right thing, we're on the right course, we just need to keep listening. So a huge thank you for listening as I've rattled through a lot of slides there, and I appreciate I've spoken at pace. The last film reference is Field of Dreams, again, one of my favourites. For those that don't know it, the quote in that is, if you build it, they will come. And I guess the point I'm making here is that the character in that film, Kevin Costner, listened to feedback before building something different. And that's the parting words I want to leave, particularly anybody who's looking to change services with, is you need to listen to the feedback before you create something new. So huge thank you. I will stop sharing and hand back to Matt.
Thank you very, very much, Joe. And thank you for, I think, a really, really interesting thing. Jim, I know you got your hand up. I know you put it up halfway through the presentation, which we know, but we'll come back to it. But I'm going to go some of the points in the chat first, because we've had a huge amount of conversation that's been starting during that I want to raise before coming to you, Jim. So please, no way being rude, but if, like Jim, you would like to come in, please do use the React symbol at the bottom of your page and use the raise hand, and I will absolutely bring you in shortly. So some of the points that were brought in, this is from Alicia. I was intrigued about folks saying they didn't need a designated officer. You asked whether people wanted faster response or a designated officer. I guess it's no surprise that faster response came first, but I suggest that designated officers would be amongst the next group of wants. And it ties into Naveen's post of how was Settle reaching those residents that effectively find it difficult to engage with, i.e. BME, younger residents, whatever that might look like. So, I mean, in those points, Joe, is it, I mean, I guess, and this is the conversation you and I have had more broadly. We're trying to get it right when actually a lot of housing has been getting it wrong for a long time. And let's not shy away from that. It's been getting it wrong for a while. At the moment, are you going, I guess, is the broader aim, right? Let's get a really good base and build, a bit like, I guess, your last point with Field of Dreams there. Is that where that mindset of going, you know what do we do first? Is that where that's coming from? And not that you're then going to completely discount the idea of designated officers, or is it a huge shift, I guess, more culturally of actually, you know what, this is just a way we're going to pivot more broadly? Case Management Solution Group, or CMSG, are the home of React, the UK's #1 case management system for ASB and community safety. We are delighted to have them as one of our key sponsors for Social Housing Roundtable 2025 into 2026. And with the ASB app now fully integrated to the platform, it allows residents to record, monitor and report issues directly to their case office in live time. What's not to love? CMSG are bringing simplicity back to case management, and I cannot recommend them enough and thank them for all of their support through this period and through the rest of the year. Thank you, CMSG, and do please go check them out on social media and on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and I can see how the framing of that has been picked up. I think the balancing act for me is that a lot of what we were getting through in terms of designated officer was that the housing officers were changing a lot. So even when you had that designated point of reference, you're having to start again and have the same conversations as people moved. And, you know, a big part of why we changed this was to try and improve morale and to reduce retention, which we have actually done within the team as well. Where we've arrived at is we have these teams within our areas. So residents are getting familiar with more than one point of reference, but when you've got a team of 4 neighbourhood partners and then community safety and tenancy support, we're not talking about loads of points of contact. It's about giving people the ability to get a prompt response with the personal touch, but it doesn't always mean it's going to be the same person every time. And that for me was really key in this, because that model might not work for others, and I can understand why, but for us it felt like a better way to deliver services. And, you know, we've seen that in terms of the TSMs and some of the transactional feedback we're seeing as well. The balancing act and the careful one is to make sure that team knows their area, that they are familiar with residents and that they're accessible. And I think for me, that's the most important part in this, as opposed to having one designated officer or point of reference. The distinction to make here is for the more, I guess the more specialised areas of the service, community safety and tenancy support, that will be a single point of contact. So it's that balance that we're trying to strike.
Thank you very much, Joe. And there's a question, I think, more point that Alex had raised during the chat, which was, our landlord is currently running a project around neighbourhoods, and asked the questions, what could any neighbourhood officer do and what should only your neighbourhood officer do? And that's quite an interesting kind of mindset to have a look at as well. Jim, I'll bring you in and then we'll go to some more of the points in the chat, but do please join us.
Yep, thanks, Matt. Hello, Joe.
Hello,
nice to hear
Jim.
what you're saying there. A lot of it comes along, I like, you know, your changing of words and that, ASB and things like that, to community and things like that. That's good. But a lot is like really perception surveys, which we're showing after the TSMs, wasn't it? And looking at the way you're going with that, my question is, the thing that Richard Blakeway particularly goes on about is a journey, the following of the journey. So you have a designated officer from the start who can follow, be it a complaint or a service disrepair, from start to finish. So if you have so many people linked into that way, is there not a possibility of cross communications and miswiring going on? Possibly.
Yeah, good question, Jim, and fair feedback. I think the community, so just the 2 points there, the community safety role, the ASB one, so that would be a designated point of contact and would be a sole one, and the same with the tenancy support. I think when it comes to the neighbourhood role, there is some risk in terms of miscommunication. But the two things that are key for us are we are located in the same office, which helps, and there's a balance to being out in neighbourhoods and being here. But our systems enable that effective handover of work. And actually, if I can just give a quick example, we've had a case recently where we came across a really upset resident, and one of the neighbourhood partners within the team was out, saw them, and saw from our system while they were out that another colleague within the team was going to be doing a settling in visit because they were a new tenant. So she had the initial conversation. She then made that referral to the person who was going to be coming out to spend a bit more time with them in person. And a lot of information was disclosed. They'd fled domestic abuse. They were in need of support. They actually didn't have any beds in their home. So a huge piece of work happened that enabled us to put beds in, get support services engaged. And the difference for that family was really significant. So I'm mentioning that as an example because that's where we've had two different people involved actually in this resident's journey. But the service was better. We had someone that picked it up, that took the initial inquiry, and then that person, they actually cleared the rest of their afternoon for when they did the visit to make time to see them. So it resonates because of what you said. Yes, there's risk. We don't always get it right. But if I compare that to how we were working before, would we have caught it? Would we have responded as quickly? I'm not sure that we would have done.
Thank you very much. And I'm trying to collate some of the points that are being raised in the chat as you're speaking. I mean, Jamie had mentioned teasing out the detail of what people mean when they indicate a need, demand, desire for element of service is do we know or do we really know? And Naveen had said that to ensure that services are tailored to the needs of residents which have an impact on improving satisfaction, how have Settle embedded the golden thread of resident engagement throughout the business and how is that measured?
Brilliant. So in terms of resident engagement, there's a number of ways. So we have a voice of resident panel that scrutinise our work and really do hold us to account. So they have been heavily involved from the beginning. We've also got two independent committee members that sit in our operations committee that are residents as well. We have an internal team here who are residents of Settle as well as being colleagues. So we have a different feedback loop via them as well. And really, it's a combination of data along with in-person feedback. You can't do one without the other. We get some great stuff through from the TSMs and from transactional surveys, but some of the most meaningful conversations certainly I've had have been out speaking to people. And the key bit has been during this journey that we've continued to do that. So I mentioned in the slides that we went out to our independent living schemes at the beginning, and it wasn't just them that we spoke to, but we went back a year later, which was a commitment I made. And different feedback, there were some positive signs, but there were still things we weren't getting right. So I think you need to have different methods and channels for communication, and you need to listen to it all. When it's identifying the themes within it, you're not going to be able to do everything that pleases everyone, but you're trying to find ways to make those incremental improvements. And I think the different streams of information and feedback we've had have helped us to shape, right, we're going to do this because we can see that it's going to make an improvement.
Wonderful. And there's a lot of people, I think, really liking some of the points you've made during the conversation. Judith has said that she really liked the treated with respect metric. So often there's a divisive, demonize the customer, patient, shopper, passenger, etc. rhetoric spread around, meaning staff can become abusive. But going purely on respect has really had an impact. Hannah's mentioned that coordinator roles are a great idea. As an ex-housing officer, I often felt that someone being able to filter quick fixes versus a new case would be a hugely beneficial way to allow me to focus on my time on my caseload and on NHD planning. So happens that I work for Paradigm. I'm on maternity leave at the moment and I've had the news about the partnership. It's great to see the business alignment and the partnerships there, which is wonderful. There was a question though around that kind of feedback parts you've mentioned, which came from Naveen and Sue. I'd say if anyone would like to bring their question themselves, please do. I'd love to hear from you. Just raise your hand or wave at me or drop me a message. We'll absolutely bring you in. But How do you close your feedback loop on resident involvement in policy review and development? And it tied into a point which I guess Sue had mentioned, which is, are you phoning tenants who've not been in contact for 6 months just before you're sending TSM questionnaires out? So has that had an impact on score? So I guess it's that piece around that feedback loop and what you're doing, and maybe that's impact that's having on TSMs more broadly.
Yeah, so I'll take the 2 points, I think, as I got them there. So that point around the 6 month contact, yeah, I mean, I'd love us to get out even sooner than that, but that's the balance with the resource versus the ability to get to residents when the trigger kicks in. So our system at the 6 month point will say there's no contact from this resident, and then it's about seeing whether that's just because actually they're okay or they require further support. Now, from a TSM point of view, we do try and pour through that data and look at where people haven't had any contacts recently and follow up. So the key thing for me with the TSMs actually is not the data, is how you follow up to that information and make a difference to the individual that's inquired. So I think there's opportunities within that. From a policy perspective, how we close the loop is our voice of resident panel, and also we've got a Settle Connect platform, which we've got lots of residents signed up to. I haven't got the exact numbers, but it's in the thousands. They scrutinise our policies, so we have engagement from them to help inform changes to policies, and it really has made a difference. There's been things we haven't considered that have gone into policy now, and then we publish those having sort of factored that feedback in. So residents have that ability to input and to change the approach, and obviously policy feeds procedure. So again, it goes back to the previous question around different streams of feedback. That's another way in which it's helped to shape the service we've got.
There's a point which came in from David, actually, which tied into that. And I will come back to people who asked questions earlier, I assure you. But how is feedback requested and what percentage typically respond? Because he said there, do you find you get feedback from a small regular group and less from residents that don't engage? But equally, and this comes from Judith, how will then is confidentiality maintained, especially in sensitive cases? So that whole piece around data arrests, do you feel you're hearing from your whole tenant base, Joe?
Yeah, I think the confidentiality point, I can understand the concerns there. You know, we have to be very, very careful with that. We have a system that we use which will protect residents' information, but equally there are occasions when we have to do it for good reason, when there's significant risk. So the case I cited at the beginning, there were concerns about the residents' well-being there, so that was shared between the two partners, and they were the ones that managed that. So that didn't go beyond those two members of the team. What was the first point of that question, Matt? Sorry, forgive me. You said
absolutely fine. It was. I'm just going to come down here. How is feedback requested and what percentage typically responds? How do you find you get feedback from a small regular group and less from residents that don't engage?
So, I mean, our voice of resident panel, you know, we're only in double figures with that group, so that's not a huge spectrum of people that's feeding back to us, but it's fairly diverse in the different areas. So there is that. The Settle Connect platform I've mentioned, as I said, we're in four figures for that. And forgive me for not knowing the exact number, but in the thousands in terms of feedback from that particular route. So we have that alongside the voice of resident panel. We've got the feedback we get from TSMs, and we've got the feedback that we get from transactional surveys. So I couldn't put an exact percentage on it. I suppose the answer to the question is yes, I do feel like it is quite representative of our resident base. There's always more that we can do, but when you're considering the smaller groups with the bigger platforms, you are getting a real mix of views coming through. And alongside that, as I said at the beginning, the in-person visits we're doing and capturing that feedback and using that to shape services for those that perhaps aren't digitally engaged is also really, really key.
Thank you very much. Alicia, I'll bring you in before I go to some of the other points we've got raised here. Well, I can't believe we're already at 15 minutes remaining. We're flying through today. But yeah, it's over to you. Alert Call return as one of the keynote sponsors for the Social Housing Roundtable in 2025 into 2026, and we're delighted to have them back. Alert Call help as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. As you can see from this touchscreen I've got with me, Alert Call's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Call, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alert Call work with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and their landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation. And in 2023, Alertical won Housing Supplier of the Year. We're delighted to have them back with us throughout the course of this year. And please do go check them out on social media and LinkedIn to find out more. Thank you very much, Alertical, for sponsoring us again.
Yeah, Joe, some really, really interesting stuff. But I'm just, following the recent announcement about the money that's coming in and the fact that via rent convergence, you are talking about a double whammy as far as tenants are concerned with them, with their rents. What I love is the fact that you are talking about working with Paradigm and working more closely. And I think it's something that we've got beyond the very basics of tenant involvement and everything else. And we need to look at how housing associations are working together. I've recently, along TPAS are helping us. I've been asked by Havebury to be part of a new panel that's totally independent scrutiny of 5 housing associations: Havebury, my own, Broadland, Freebridge, Orwell and Saffron. And we've had someone from all 5 of them, all 5 housing associations, come to us to talk about their preparation for AWAB's law. They all have different approaches. Yeah. And we became aware that some of them were actually hearing what each other were doing for the first time, and they were saying, as much as us having input, they were saying, oh, that's a really good idea. And the rest of them liked Havebury's Healthy Homes idea. I think that's something that's going to be adopted. What are you doing? It's very frustrating sometimes as tenants that you are not sharing good practice. There seems to be this thing that if you're doing something well, you kind of keep it to yourself. And if you're talking about making savings and not passing on, passing on the money, the increases in rents to tenants, the bit where you are actually sharing practice, looking at how you can save money by working more closely with other housing associations, that is key. So I'm glad to see you're doing it. I love your approach. I love the fact that that you're community safety rather than ASB. And so I'm hoping that you are getting your message across to some of the other landlords who frankly still aren't making a change, So it's a point really rather than the question.
No, it's great. Joe, any thoughts?
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, no, really, really good reflections there. And I think one of the things I've kicked myself a bit on is that this is the first time I've really brought to life where we are with this particular model. As I said at the beginning, it's not perfect, but it's better, and it's using resident feedback to change. So I think what is incumbent on me and other leaders within the business, but also other organisations, is sharing that best practice and seeing what others are doing and trying to drive some change. We're really aligned with Paradigm, and we've already shared some really good ideas in that space, which is great. But I think getting that broader message out is key. And the point about the kind of financial pressures, the changes we've made within the team since we've changed it haven't cost more money. We've moved resource based on demand. So just to make that distinction, because I didn't in the actual presentation, this hasn't been a case of throwing lots of money at it, because we don't have that. It's about thinking within the scope of the service what we can do differently. So some really powerful points here, Alicia, and I'd be keen to hear from you following today on how your work is progressing with TPAS as well.
I think it's really interesting that I think this is the reason why the roundtables, like I figured that this would just be 5 or 6 of us in a room for a few months and then this thing would die out. It's because of almost what Alicia said there. I think the challenge is that there aren't enough places for landlords to sometimes share best practice without them going, great, well, I have to go to a conference for 3 days, I have to do this for 2 days, or whatever it'll be. But the blend between going, how do we share best practice, but then not pull resource away and that kind of stuff is a very difficult one. I don't think it's one housing's got right, Alicia. And I think, hopefully things like this, Joe bringing it to the table, going, by the way, this is it, and if anyone wants to follow up, find me on LinkedIn, let's have a chat, is one of the ways we can do it. And just before I bring in Brian, there was a point which had come in, Joe, that I wanted to kind of raise, because there's a few points that would come in via a few of us that were chatting in one thread on the conversation, which was, how do you feel that this new model you're working at is doing in terms of building trust. So with some residents, surely consistency is key. The problem is that many tenants still aren't certain about who they should be contacting. We need good landlords to be sharing best practices a bit more, as Alicia has just mentioned. There was a point about it's good to see data-driven seems to mean feedback-driven rather than reliance on over-surveillance of residents. I said I guess you could flip this by asking, with the brands you trust, do you need a dedicated person or just a service that delivers? Do you find during the conversation there was a demand for boots on the ground or for more online communication? And finally, in relation to data, did you find a lack of information on the people living in the homes rather than just a tenant was missing and needed to be enhanced with the knowledge from officers on the ground? All that pieces around knowledge, understanding, trust. How have you found that this shift in model has affected, I guess, trust between residents and landlord?
Well, I suppose I'll lean into the point I made that our trust score has jumped in 2 years from 6.2 to 7.5. Now, that's just a metric, so great. But what does that mean in reality? I think the examples I see, and I mentioned one earlier in answer to Jim's question, was that residents trust us to tell us the things that perhaps they don't feel comfortable with generally sharing, and actually our ability to get back to them. That's the change I've seen. And when we see the amount of contacts in timescale, so 95% now, and again we'd need to get to that 400%, but it's a challenge because of the amount of work that's coming through. If we're getting back to people more promptly, and we're increasing the skill set within the teams, a lot of the neighbourhood partners, tenancy support and community safety, are doing the CIH qualification as well, which is really important. But we're starting to see knowledge, expertise, responsiveness build, and I think that breeds trust. So it's keeping an eye on that metric, but it's also making sure that the feedback we're getting from residents really demonstrates that they trust us to do what we need to do. And actually, the key bit in this is that for those roles, quite often they're the conduit to other areas of the business. So the ability for neighbourhood partners to be enabled to get things done with other internal services is something we're working at and is improving, but is an ongoing process.
Thank you very much. Brian, I'm going to bring you in. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I've got Brian and Naveen to hear from. So Brian, over to you.
I was interested to hear, Joe, that when you got the consultation and everything done, it wasn't what you were expecting. What I find is with really involved tenants, which probably most of us are, that you have a skill and a knowledge for details and policies and everything else, but it's having them people on the ground who get the feedback from, for example, an area that needs a litter pick done or something like that done. And it's that on the ground, getting things done and seeing to be getting it done, that builds that trust back with tenants. Did you find that having them boots on the ground made a big difference to the feedback and the consultation?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Brian. A really good one. Absolutely, I did. And I think perhaps what I underestimated initially was how much of that can inform the strategy. And that wasn't any disrespect to the people that were involved, but the ideas that came forward, and particularly the shift in focus on the big three areas initially and see how that works, wasn't my original thinking. So I also found that going out and doing the visits myself helped inform my views and thoughts on it. And you're right, sometimes you're a bit removed, so you're making decisions to look at more efficient ways of working, but actually you need to be out in the field, so to speak, liaising with residents. And one of the things that does work really well here is we 4 times a year will go out en masse as an organisation and do a big door knock and a neighbourhood action week exercise. And sometimes just those individual conversations start to inform how you're thinking and what you're doing. So there's a balance between the strategic and the operational, but you're absolutely right that the feedback on the ground really helped to shape what it ended up being. But it isn't a single state. This continues to evolve and change, and it's that constant feedback that's helping us to improve it incrementally. And quite often it's 3 steps forward, 1 step back. We don't always get it right, but generally we're seeing the trend improve, and that's where we've got to carry on.
Thank you, Joe. Naveen, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I find this very, very interesting. And thanks, Joe, for sharing your slides and your ideas around your operating model. We're currently going through what you're going through, or what you have been through. And there is a lot in your presentation that we are already doing. I think it's very important that staff walk the walk They need to get out there to be able to actually know what residents are experiencing and how the services are having an impact on them on the ground, because it can be distorted. However, there's a question that I really need to ask you in relation to staff. How have staff embraced the change? Because there's always resistance in some pockets. And how have you dealt with that?
Thank you, Naveen. That's a really good question. There was a lot of cynicism early on, and we restructured, and that meant some colleagues left the business. So what I grappled with initially was getting that buy-in. People understandably attached to other colleagues were seeing a change and were quite scared, I think, of what that change would mean. So seeing was believing, I suppose, is the phrase that would stick with me here. When they started to see a better balance in workload, a fair allocation of the resource, when they started to see that a big thing was going off on holiday and not coming back to a workload, because it literally stops with the allocation going to other people. It was those things that were starting to make a difference. And we've had fluctuations, we're in a better place than what we was, but actually our most recent peak on survey dipped slightly because we've seen some workload in flux, some flux in the workload. So that's me being very transparent there. But I think the bit that has stuck with me certainly recently is keeping that feedback loop going. Being immersed in a partnership has made that quite hard. But the recent meeting we did with the teams has given me a few different thoughts that I wouldn't have had. So I think sometimes you take a jump and people might not believe in it, but actually, if you know from the resident feedback, the data, and some of the colleague feedback you're getting that it's the right thing to do, you need to stay true to the ideas and then let the feedback after that shape what it ends up being. So you have my sympathy, and I'm happy to talk after this if it's useful. I think you stand by your principles and you let the model do the work in the longer term, because it will pay dividends.
I think sometimes, like anything, it's just difficult to keep that consistency going, but it's got to be top down, doesn't it, Joe? And I think that's the other side of it that's been so important. And I can see Angelica's just put in the chat there, thinking about local customer service offering as you've described, Joe. I'm finding this quite comforting. This model is scalable for a national provider like ourselves. I've really taken away how we can further refine it to get more out of it for customers and colleagues. It's just gone. Based on constantly reviewing demand, data and feedback. Different areas in the country demand different things. And I think this is the key part, isn't it? It's that constant feedback loop. I think that's probably the message to take away. And Alex has said, I've often asked the question whether a household's information could be updated by neighbourhood officers or other operatives with contact. Something that's come up on the roundtable before would be really key. And James has just said this was done a few years ago. I think this is in relation to Barbara's point. With the Northwest Landlords Collective Group, they engaged the tenants from mixed housing. I think this is another forum that's being set up, which was great to see. Joe, a few people have asked, just in terms of final thoughts, and also what's the best way for people to kind of keep in touch with you and to engage with you moving on from here?
Yeah. First thing, say thank you for listening. I really appreciate all giving up your time this morning. I suppose my final thoughts are that there's enormous pressures on the sector, but that doesn't mean we can't create something different and improve how we deliver services. And I've said throughout, this isn't a perfect model, but it's progressively improving. So listening and acting, I suppose, is the key bit, which connects to a pretty key tenant satisfaction measure as well, now that I mention it. So the key takeaway, I suppose, is for anybody that's on this call that's thinking about changing the service or is in the midst of doing it, is to make sure you're really listening to the feedback that's coming through and demonstrating you can act upon it. Because as soon as you stop doing that, it'll end up being something that you need to change again. And for the residents on the call, making sure your voice is heard is really, really key for me. And I think the point that Alicia made about how we spread that across the sector is the part that I'm going to take away today as well. In terms of contacting me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share my email address after this as well, and answer any other questions that people have got. So huge thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Joe. And I think everyone can see exactly why I wanted to bring to the session today. There is no roundtable next week because it's the housing conference in Manchester. I wasn't going to be going. I've been asked to go up and speak at it, so I can't do both. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry.
See you there, Matt.
But the week after is going to be, it's National ASB Week, ironically, when we've talked about community safety and ASB today. and the team from Green and Burton Associates are coming on to talk about quite an interesting conversation on when we're dealing with reports of ASB which seemingly aren't ASB, can we just ignore them? What should we be doing? And looking at that more broadly. So hopefully providing a lot of insight there. Obviously, that's not the answer, that's the discussion. So looking forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks. If anyone is interested in kind of jumping on to do future sessions through late summer, we're already looking at booking kind of September, October in now. So if you're interested in doing a future roundtable, please reach out. But for now, Joe, a huge thank you to you for coming on today, and I look forward to speaking with you all soon. Cheers.
Thank you, Joe. Are you going to share the slides at all?
Happy to. Yeah. Happy to share
Brilliant.
them.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.